Hi, I'm going to be starting with discussion question 1, which is to shape a convincing argument whether the narrator is male or female. So what I found interesting is when I read the text, I started off reading it without looking at the study questions. I probably got halfway through the reading and just assumed the narrator was male. Like, I never looked for evidence to support one way or the other. I just instinctually was like, yeah, the narrator's a male. And then I got about halfway through, decided to look at the study questions, and the very first one was shape a convincing argument that the narrator is male or female. And I had to go back and read everything, and I was like, oh, it never actually clarifies. So I went back and reread it, and I actually found more evidence that the narrator was female, which I don't know if there's ever supposed to be a conclusion, like a final conclusion drawn of the narrator, but I'll show the evidence I found that the narrator's female because I felt it to be a little more convincing than what my instinct was telling me. On page 57, when talking about Emily's dress that she's making, the narrator says, yet she had about her the look of a woman who has calculated the exact amount of flesh she will show at a dinner party. And that felt like a very woman crafted sentence, which obviously the author is a woman, so she could write that and it could be from the point of view of a male or female, but this sounds like something that a woman knows very well, is like how to portray herself and how to come across, and like the exact amount of flesh she'd show at a dinner party is something that like women often have to think about and calculate, and it's something that a lot of men will just like gloss over and not realize there's thought being put into it. I'm not saying all men, but on the whole. And then on page 84, there was also some evidence to the narrator being female. At the bottom of 84, it says, but while Emily was part of this communal act, the communal feast, she was at the same time feeling as girls traditionally did. She wanted, I knew, to be alone with Gerald. She would have liked that experience, the old one. And the use of the little clause, I knew, in that sentence is basically the narrator saying, like, I understand that feeling because I'm a woman too. Like, I understand the, crush you have on an older guy, even if you are pretending to enjoy the communal time with him and everyone. The narrator knows she wants to be alone with him in the traditional way. So that was another piece of evidence that I found convincing. There was a few more things scattered throughout the text. On page 13, the narrator mends Emily's clothes, which is a more traditionally woman skill. However, this is also in a post-apocalyptic time with we don't know what's going on in the world, where I'm sure men would have also picked up more traditional woman skills. And then on page 58, Emily borrows the narrator's shirt, which of course could be a man's shirt, and she, maybe it's a little bigger, she wears it like a dress, but I was thinking that was more likely that it was a woman's shirt she was borrowing. And then before I move on to the next point, also on page 12, it says, it is as if a weight redistributes itself as when a child shifts position in the womb. That feels like a simile that a woman would be more inclined to make, because obviously even if the narrator has never been pregnant, she would have a womb, so understand the feeling and make an analogy related to that, whereas I don't believe a man would try to make an analogy to something shifting in a womb when he himself doesn't have one. But moving on to the next point, number 5, is the government in this novel impotent? I actually found very little discussion about the government in general, which I thought was very interesting and also contributes to my answer to the question, which is yes, the government does appear to be impotent, because in the majority of the dystopian end of the world type novels and short stories we've been reading, the government is a huge role in the story. Whether it's Brave New World, where the government is basically controlling the entire society, or even if it's when we're reading the Communist Manifesto and communist inspired short stories and texts, the government plays a very large role in the society, because at the end of the day, there's always some sort of shifting power dynamic, or like people who want to be in power or who don't want to be in power because they want it all to be equal, but there's always some sort of motivation from people in power. And in this, it was very much glossed over, as well as the natural disaster or whatever took place that led to society being like this was glossed over. And I enjoy that Doris Lessing did this to more focus on the like interpersonal relationships and like shifting like social dynamics between people in the novel. But on page 104 to 105 is where I find the most like evidence about the government no longer existing or being important. It basically on 104 asks about a ruling class, and it says the ruling class, but that was a dead phrase, so they said, very well then, the kind of person who ran things, administered, sure. Like, it was not something that the narrator concerns him or herself with on daily, like in daily life. It was just a background, like, yeah, there is a ruling class, or there was, like, they don't really have much power or sway. And then on page 105, it's talking about the ruling class again, and it says, has there been a time in our country when the ruling class was not living inside its glass bell of respectability or of wealth, shutting its eyes to what on outside? So essentially, the people who were or are the ruling class and the wealthy don't really concern themselves with the rest of society. They're happy to go off into their own little part of society and not concern themselves with the poor or the regular citizens, or don't really care much to like exercise power over them, which I thought was interesting because the majority of the text we've read, the plot has been like pushed forward by the ruling class wanting to control someone or have some form of like authority. So I thought that was interesting. And then the third study question, number 15, talking about Hugo and his function within the novel. I thought he was a very interesting character to have, because from the start I was like, why do we not know whether he's a dog or a cat? Like, I thought that was so strange, but then I realized it kind of like shows his dual natures in the novel. So he has like his dog, which is his like human side, and then his cat, which is his more like subservient side. And he is kind of half used to relate to the characters. So on page 62, Emily comes home, and when she does, she gives attention to Hugo, and she'll like caress him and snuggle with him and play with him, but not really talk to our narrator. And I was seeing like Hugo is kind of standing in as like a middleman of their relationship, where maybe Emily feels like she can't talk to the narrator or connect with the narrator, but when there's just like an animal there, you can like get out your emotion or affection on the animal. So there was that. And then also on 62 and 81, Hugo is discussed as a sort of prisoner or slave. On page 81 specifically, it says, but people need slaves and victims and appendages. And of course, many of our pets are that, because they've been made into what we think they should be, just as human beings can become what they're expected to be. And Hugo is kind of like a stand-in for our characters to have some sort of authority over a creature or someone. So it's like when their whole life is up in the air and they have no form of control over anything, Hugo is half able to relate to them and be a form of connection, but then also have something that they can have authority over and control and boss around. And then I thought it was also interesting, there's a line, I don't know if I wrote it down, but it basically says Hugo is like a human almost exactly, but without the ability for romantic love. And I thought that was interesting because throughout the novel, it's appearing that humans may not have the same capability for romantic love either. On page 83, it even says, Emily began to fall in love, if that's even an acceptable term to use in today's society. So I thought it was interesting that Hugo being compared to a human as almost human, but without romantic love, the people in our society may not be capable of that either. So does that just mean Hugo and humans are at the same level? Anyways, thank you for watching my video. I hope Italy was amazing.